Welcome to Get Thready with me. This is the YouTube show where I try and sew a piece of clothing or two from scratch, and I take you all along with me for the ride. Lately, I've been learning how to draw my fashion ideas down onto physical pieces of paper so that they're not just forever stuck up in my imagination and then forgotten. Because I think that I'm not very good at drawing, well, because I'm not, but because of this, drawing down my fashion designs is something that I've avoided doing for years. However, something that really helped out in that regard were these free fashion templates from Preda Template. All I gotta do is trace over the figure and then I can draw my clothing designs down onto that figure. This isn't sponsored, by the way, I've just been finding it a super useful way to teach myself how to draw fashion designs. So in today's video, I'm going to be trying to bring these two particular designs of mine to life, which is one, this cute ruffly blouse, and two, this dress. To make both of them, I'm going to be using secondhand fabric. The dress's fabric is from a large bolt of secondhand fabric that I inherited from my uncle, whereas I found the pink fabric for the blouse at a thrift shop just a few weeks ago. Actually, I think that this fabric was originally a baby's quilt cover. So I'm sorry if I am ruining someone's precious childhood blanket. No, but I'm actually using this because the fabric actually looks like it's in pretty good condition. It doesn't look like it's been used at all. And I really like the design on both sides of the blanket. One side has a pink gingham and the other these cute botanical graphics on pink. So what I did first was to rip out the stitches holding the two squares of fabric together through the opening here. And I'm going to use this piece of fabric to make my blouse, and I'll leave that pink gingham aside for another project. So in this video, I'm gonna go through the process of how I made the blouse, but I made the dress in exactly the same way. The only thing that is different is the length of the fabric that is used for the skirt compared to the ruffle. But I'll go through the difference between them when I get up to it in the tutorial. So let's get started. The inspiration for this top actually came from a t-shirt that I recently thrifted. Two of them, in fact. I managed to find this white and black t-shirt both in the same size and style at my local Vinnie's. I really like the loose fitting top with this ruffly sleeve design. It's also a sleeve style that I've recently been seeing all over the place. So I used all of these as inspiration for both a dress and a blouse that will both fit me and that are both going to be constructed using identical sleeve and bodice shapes. So the first thing that I need to do is to turn this design into a paper pattern that I can use to cut out my fabric. I used this slightly large, loose-fitting t-shirt as the base for my pattern design. Using a basic piece of clothing whose style and fit that you really like on you can be a good first step in creating patterns for your own designs, and from there, you can change and manipulate the pattern and the fabric type to create your own individual piece of clothing. It's a technique that even professional fashion designers will often use. To make the pattern, first I folded this basic t-shirt in half like this and I placed it down onto some pattern paper. Then using two taped together pencils, this is a neat trick to quickly add seam allowance to your pattern piece. I traced around the main bodice part of the t-shirt, ignoring the sleeves. So I traced around the outsides of the t-shirt, and when I got to the armhole seam, I placed my finger on top of this seam and I drew some marks underneath at the point where my finger was, which I then joined up into one continuous line. Also, I wanted to make the bodice pattern high-waisted or cropped, so I also shortened the length of the pattern here as well. And after cutting it out of the paper, this is what the basic block pattern looks like. So now that I have my basic bodice piece, which I know will fit me well because it's based off a nice loose-fitting t-shirt, I am going to change certain parts of it to give me the fit and style that I want. So compared to the original t-shirt, I wanted a design with a slightly wider and lower neckline on both the front and back, a drop shoulder. I also wanted it to flare out a bit at the bottom of the bodice and also to curve up slightly towards the sides. So I taped the basic bodice pattern onto another piece of butcher's paper and I made these adjustments onto the new paper. So I'm going to put 2 points here and here to make a wider, deeper neckline. Down the side here is going to stay the same because I want it to remain about the same width or the same looseness as the t-shirt. I'm just making sure that the line is totally straight so that this edge of the pattern can be placed on the fold of my fabric. For the drop shoulder, I extended the shoulder seam line down to here, which also means that I'm gonna have to change the shape of the armhole. I actually made the armhole completely straight because I'm going to be attaching a straight rectangle piece, the gathered sleeve, to this armhole. But because I don't want to change the overall width of the bodice, I brought that armhole line back towards where the side seam is gonna be. And then I also curved this line just to make it more like an armhole and improve the fit a bit. So I also wanted the bodice to flow flare out a little bit at the bottom, so I made this side seam line flare out a bit from the original pattern. And finally, I wanted a slightly curved hem for the top, so I made this line end a little bit shorter than in the original pattern on this side, and then I drew a curved line from the other side up to this point. Importantly, I also made sure that both these angles were as close to 90-degree right angles as possible. So I drew down all the straight lines, and then I removed that old paper pattern to add the new curved lines onto my new pattern. To create some of those curved lines on my new pattern, I used a French ruler, which is this curvy ruler here. For some of the less curvy curves, I just kind of eyeballed them when I drew them. So this is going to be my final bodice pattern piece. And finally, I'm going to add important pattern markers onto it. This double-headed arrow shows you how to place the pattern along the grain line of a woven fabric, or along the stretch if you're using a stretchy fabric. This line here shows you where the pattern needs to be placed on the fold of the fabric. And I also drew the seam allowance back in onto the pattern using that double pencil trick, although this time I drew the seam allowance onto the inside of that outer line I'd already drawn on, because we already included the seam allowance in the previous older pattern. This is just going to show me approximately where I will need to stitch. I made a couple of adjustments here and there just because I thought I could improve the fit a little bit. And finally, I wrote down the label for this pattern piece, which is going to be called the front and back bodice. So I'm going to cut out 2 of these on the fabric's fold. Both the front and back will be identical, and they will make up the entire bodice piece. Okay, so onto the sleeve ruffle pattern. This is a lot simpler. I wanted the sleeve ruffles to be about 1.5 times the width of the sleeve opening, just to allow for some nice gathers in that sleeve fabric. So I simply drew down a rectangle that was 1.5 times the width of the sleeve opening. So the width of the sleeve opening on my pattern was about 7 inches 3/4. So I made the sleeve pattern about 11 inches 3/4 wide. That makes it 1.5 times the width of the armhole opening. And I wanted the sleeve on the final garment to be about 4 inches long, so I made the rectangle 5 inches long across here, because that'll include hemming and seam allowance on both sides of the rectangle as well. So I drew out a rectangle that was 11 inches 3/4 wide and 5 inches long. And because the actual finished garment is going to be 3-dimensional and the sleeve is going to be attached to an armhole circumference made out of 2 of these bodice armhole openings, the sleeve rectangles that I need to cut out will need to be doubled in width. So I placed a little marker down here to show where the fabric will need to be cut on the fold to make this rectangle double this width. And because I have 2 arms, I need 2 sleeve ruffles, so I'm going to cut it out twice. So I added a 2 times marker along the label, reminding me that I need to cut it out twice. So these are the 2 pattern pieces that I essentially need to get this started. I'm also going to have to cut out some bias binding for the neckline, and also a rectangle that will create the ruffle on the top or the skirt on the dress. But I won't be needing pattern pieces for these because they're very simple. They're just gonna be rectangles, and I can cut them out from the fabric later on. Now it's time to use these pattern pieces to cut out the fabric. So I folded my fabric in half and I set my bodice pattern piece on top, lined up the straight edge with the fold of the fabric, and then I cut around the pattern using my rotary cutter. Unfolded, I have this piece of fabric. I repeated this exactly the same to give myself 2 identical pieces of fabric, and these 2 pieces will make up the front and the back of the bodice. Then I cut out the sleeve ruffles in the exact same way, giving me these 2 matching rectangle pieces. I'm going to be using bias binding to finish off the raw edges of the neckline, and I'm going to make my own bias tape using the same fabric. You'll notice that the bottom edge of this fabric already has some creases in it, but I'm going to use this already creased fabric to my advantage, because bias binding is essentially a long, thin strip of fabric that has a crease down the middle. So I cut off this bottom piece of the fabric in a long, thin strip to use it as bias binding for the neckline. Bias tape is usually cut on the diagonal of a woven fabric to give it maximum stretch. However, I've cut mine along the grain of the fabric because I don't have enough fabric to cut it on the bias. I think that I cut it along the weft, but I always get warp and weft confused. But whichever is the direction that gives you the most stretch on a woven that is non-stretchy fabric, well, that's the direction in which I cut my bias tape. And I usually find that this works out just fine. For the ruffle on the very bottom of the blouse, or for the skirt on the dress, I'm gonna cut that out after I've already constructed the basic top part of the piece, because that piece's width is going to depend on how wide my top is. To sew the top together, first I placed the front piece down right side up, and then I placed the back piece on top right side down. So the two pieces are sandwiched right sides together. Then I sewed them together at the shoulder seams. The next step is attaching the bias binding around the neck hole that I've just created. So you'll remember that my bias tape already had a crease down the center of it. I made sure this crease would stay by giving it another iron. I ironed that long strip in half lengthways again. And then because I want the bias binding to be hidden on my neckline, I folded one of the halves of this bias tape in half again, and I ironed another crease into this. So now I have two creases in the bias tape, one crease that divides the strip into two, and one that divides it into quarters. And a little note, I would have found this whole process a bit easier if I'd used a slightly wider piece of fabric than this as my bias tape. But that's something I can learn from to do in the future. Anyway, to attach the bias tape to the neckline, I placed it along the neckline's raw edge like this, right sides together. And next I'm going to sew it on, sewing directly on the middle crease like this. And you'll notice that while I'm actually sewing it on here, I didn't use any clips or sewing pins to hold the tape in place onto the neckline, because I actually find it easier to place the binding with my fingers as I go. When I got back around to where I started, I held the two ends of the bias tape together like this, and I carefully sewed up to just about where the two ends met. Then I sewed these two ends together with a straight stitch like this. And I realized that I had just managed to not line the seam of the bias tape up with the shoulder seam. Damn it. Oh well, practice makes perfect. Next time I will get closer, I am sure. Anyway, then I clipped off the extra bit of bias tape that was outside that seam, and I pressed the seam open, and then I sewed over the top of that open seam, sewing the bias tape totally in place until I got back to my first stitch. So next I'm going to understitch the bias tape. To do that, I folded it up, making sure all the fabric in this seam was pointing up. And then I'm going to go around the neckline again like this, trying to stitch on top of the bias tape as close to the seam as possible. Then the final step is to fold the bias tape inside the top so that it can no longer be seen when it's flipped right way around. So that looks something like this. It's easier to see what I'm doing if I do this while the shirt is inside out. So I turn the shirt inside out and I folded the bias tape down inside the neckline on its middle crease, and then I also turned over the quarter crease to ensure that there's no raw edges on the inside of the garment. Now you can see how tiny this ended up being, which is why I wish I had started with a wider bias tape, but I still managed to make it work. The last step is to stitch all the way around the inside of the neckline, stitching the bias tape in place like this. Again, I haven't pinned or clipped the bias tape in place because I find that it's easier to fold it down onto the neckline as I go. There's a lot more tips and tricks to attaching a bias binding that you can find a lot of specific tutorials on, so I'll link some of my favorites in the description box below, but I just wanted to show you what works for me. Okay, so now we have a pretty finished neckline. Next, I flipped the shirt inside out again, and then I attached the front and the back bodice pieces at the sides here and here. Now, to finish off all the raw edges and seams on the inside of the garment, I'm going to either overlock these raw edges, or for the particularly curvy bits, because I'm not good at overlocking on curves, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch over the raw edges. So if you don't have an overlocker, you can still finish off your raw seams and fabric edges by zigzagging over them with a very short zigzag stitch setting. And this is what zigzagging over the edges looks like. So next, I tried the top on to make sure that it was all fitting okay. And it's all good. Note that I have not added a zipper or any buttons of any sort, and that's because I have intentionally made this garment quite loose fitting. Neither my finished blouse or my dress has a zipper. So next we're going to add ruffles around the sleeves and the bottom. So I'm going to put the shirt aside for a moment, and for both sleeve pieces, I'm going to follow the exact same steps. so I'll just show you what I did for one of them. First, I'm going to gather this top edge by doing a long basting stitch along here. To do this, I set my sewing machine to its longest straight stitch setting. I made sure that the threads on the machine, before I had even done any sewing, were nice and long. And then I placed the fabric underneath and started sewing. Now, when making gathers, you don't want to do any back stitch at the start or the end of your stitching. So after I sewed a line of long straight stitches down that edge, when I got to the end, I pulled the top and bottom threads out a little bit further like this, and I cut them about 5 inches away from the fabric. So I left the threads nice and long. Then to gather the fabric, I pulled gently on the top thread like this. And doing this created some gathers in the fabric. So I pushed the gathers along the fabric like this, and then I repeated this. And I did it on both ends to keep the gathers fairly even along the fabric. I kept gathering the fabric more and more until this rectangle piece was reduced in length so that when it's folded in half, it's about the same length as the bodice's armhole, plus about 1 inch. After spacing the gathers out roughly evenly along the sleeve piece, I placed that folded over, gathered rectangle so that the two ends were pointing down. And then I sewed the gathered sleeve into a loop by sewing a straight line down here. I finished off the raw edges by cutting off the excess fabric from the seam and then overlocking this edge. Then to actually attach this piece, first I turned the shirt the right way around, then watch carefully because this can be a little bit confusing. I turned the sleeve around so that the raw bottom edge was pointing towards the shirt and the seam of the sleeve was facing down. Then I opened up the sleeve ruffle and I placed it around the armhole opening like this. Basically, I wanted to match up the ruffled edge and the raw edge of the armhole opening, while also making sure that the seams on both pieces matched up as well. And then I used sewing clips to pin the sleeve on evenly around the armhole, and I sewed it on all the way around the armhole like this. Here's a closer up look at where my stitches are going to go. I'm going to stitch the sleeve on just on the inside of the line of stitching that created the ruffles, so that the long gathered stitch will get caught up inside the seam and you won't be able to see it on the outside of the garment. And take your time sewing this because it can be a little bit tricky. And then when it's all turned the right way around, it should look like this. And then finally, I'm going to create a small hem around the bottom of the sleeve. So first, I overlocked this raw edge. If you don't have an overlocker, you can zigzag stitch the edge, or you can use basting scissors on the edge, or you can do a rolled hem instead. And then I flipped this finished edge up about 1 inch inside the sleeve, and I sewed along here all the way around the sleeve opening. Also, I don't really bother to pin the fabric when I'm hemming. I just kind of eyeball it and place it in the right spot as I go along. I find that this is a lot faster and just as accurate. Now, finally, we're up to the last step. So this is where the top and the dress deviate a little bit. The difference between them is simply in the length of fabric that you add to the blouse part. Both the ruffle on the shirt and the skirt on the dress use simple rectangles that are just 3 times the width of the top section when it's laid flat. So the dress uses a rectangle piece of fabric that is 3 times the top part's width and 18 inches long for my dress, whereas the shirt uses a rectangle piece of fabric that is 3 times the top part's width, but only 3.5 inches long. So I'm just going to show you how I attach the ruffle onto the pink top, but the process is exactly the same for attaching the skirt onto the dress. So I had this amount of pink fabric left over, which I chopped in half, making each half 3.5 inches along here. And then I measured out the width of the fabric that I wanted by just measuring it against the bottom edge of the top part while it's laid flat. So once, twice, and I had to add another third part because I was working with remnants. So 3. I simply attached these 2 rectangle pieces together by placing one on top of the other, right sides together, and sewing a straight stitch down here. And so now I have a long, thin rectangle that's 3.5 inches long and approximately 1, 2, 3 times the width of the bottom of the shirt. And this is attached in essentially the exact same way as how we attach the sleeve. So I'll just run through it really quickly. The only thing that I did different was that I hemmed the rectangle of fabric first, but it doesn't really matter what order you do it in unless the ruffle is like really tiny, then you might want to hem it first. Anyway, so after I hemmed that end, I gathered the opposite edge, reducing it down in size to 2 times the width of the shirt, or when it's folded over, it's about the same width. I did a straight stitch down the 2 ends of the rectangle to attach them together and make the gathered fabric into a loop, and then I turned the top the right way around, making sure the gathered piece of fabric was turned the wrong way around, and I placed the gathered piece around the bottom edge of the top like this so that the raw edge and the gathered edge met up. And then I clipped the gathered piece on evenly all the way around, and I sewed it on just like I did for the sleeves. And then I finished off the raw edges of the seam with an overlocker, and I turned it all the right way around, and it looks like this. So now let's have another look at the finished pieces, and I'm also going to show you how I like to style them. The pastel pink color of the top looks really nice when paired with a darker color, like these jeans. The jeans also stop my outfit from looking totally like a 5-year-old at a birthday party, which I mean is a fine aesthetic to have for sure, but it's just not what I was going for. I'm really enjoying styling this dress with a very loose fitting denim shirt that's the same length as the dress. It gives the outfit a kind of 80s feel, and it's also very comfortable. Seriously, aside from like just wearing my pajamas, this dress is the comfiest piece of clothing that I own. So I really hope you enjoyed this video and enjoyed watching my process from inspiration to design to pattern to construction to finished garment. And these 2 pieces are actually something I've been wearing all the time, particularly the dress. The dress is a perfect everyday piece. However, I would also like to make the dress out of these fabric patterns as well. I might just order some custom fabric to make another dress with. And if you would like to see the process of me ordering some custom fabric to make a design out of, let me know. Or also, if you'd like a more in-depth tutorial on how I draw down and digitize my patterns, let me know if you'd like to see that as well. So this was a massive video to complete. It involved many hours of sewing and filming and editing. So if you're actually seeing this, we did it! Thank you for all being patient with me when there's gaps of a few weeks between uploads. I'm actually doing pretty well with my health and chronic illness management right now. I know that some people start to worry when I haven't uploaded for a while. I've had some worried comments and messages, which is so dang sweet. But it's actually the fact that I am doing so well right now that's been the most time-consuming thing. The amount of physio and rehabilitation that I've been doing right now to maintain an okay level of health and like minimize my chronic pain, just, it's a lot, and it is super exhausting. Shout out to all my other chronic illness warriors who have taken any kind of steps to improve their health, because it is tiring. But hooray for relatively okay health. Also, my next video out, my next tutorial video at least, should be a review on these embroidery pens. And you'll see why I've done little air quotes for that in my video on it. Yeah, it's not good. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much to all of my supporters on Patreon, and for those people who have donated on Ko-fi or supported my merchandise. Honestly, I could not do what I do without your financial support. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. Also, if you have been missing having some regular Annika in your life, me and Giovanni, who always has to make an entrance. Stop. Tell everyone what about our podcast.
Yeah, we've got a podcast.
We have a podcast.
It's a good one. It's called Watch, Read, Listen. You can find it in the iTunes store. Here it is. Is this where the thing will be?
I don't know, it might be on this side.
Here it is.
You just don't point.
It's a podcast. You can listen to it, get it in your ear holes.
All right, get out of here.
No, let's tell them what it is very briefly.
Okay, what is it?
It's a podcast where we just talk about the things we've been watching and reading and listening to throughout the week.
Also, we just kind of chat.
We chat. we shoot the breeze in the way that we're apparently not allowed to right now.
No, because videos are quick and edited, and our podcast is much more like long and rambly, but in a good way.
Bum, 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 bum.
So, yeah, I think that's it. And I will see you guys next time. Why did I do that? I don't know. I have been filming for a long time. Okay, bye. You can now support me via a one-off contribution by visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/Annika Victoria. You can also support me on an ongoing basis and get access to exclusive content by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Annika Victoria to learn how.